So happy Friday, everyone. My name is Christina Hahn, and my partner Colin Yarbrough and I will be presenting on the visible and invisible design of the voter experience in Dallas County. So we know that Texas has been in the news a lot lately, especially in regards to suppressing various civic rights, such as voting. So let's talk about that. In honor of the first day of the State Fair of Texas, which is today, we wanted to feature Big Tex, Texas's equivalent to the Statue of Liberty. He's a Texas icon that stands in the middle of the Texas State Fair every year. So Big Tex is here to help us recap what the heck is happening in Texas. So earlier this month, the Texas legislature passed a controversial bill that would suppress voter rights. Under this new bill, 24-hour and drive-through voting would be banned. There'd be limits to early voting hours, a criminalization of distributing vote-by-mail applications, and the allowance of partisan poll watchers unprecedented access to polling places. These types of policy design are the invisible elements that shape a voter's experience and ability to vote before, during, and even after they cast a ballot. So here's our agenda for today. I will be covering the learning objectives and the voting experience journey of voters in Dallas County. Colin will be taking us through the built environment and its relationship to civic engagement. We'll then discuss the intersection of the voting experience and the built environment and how it affects voters. Finally, we'll end with a short and sweet group discussion. Here are our learning objectives for today's session. How do the intersections of race, class, education, able-bodiedness shape citizens' civic experiences? How can we identify elements of the built environment? What are the social and economic factors that influence the construction of the built environment? How does the built environment determine people's ability to be civically engaged? What are all the steps that go into the voting experience? What are the invisible elements of the voter experience that have historically not been given as much attention to by designers? And finally, what are some steps that we as designers and community members can take to make voting more accessible to all citizens, regardless of their social and physical locations? So let's talk about the voter experience design in Dallas County. Graphic design through an election. What first drew me to the topic was Paula Scher's bold assertion in a Netflix special on design, which was that the confusing design of the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County through an election. For those of you who are unaware or unborn in the year 2000, the confusing layout of the butterfly ballot caused a large swath of elderly Jewish Americans in Palm Beach County, Florida, to mistakenly vote for an infamous anti-Semite. This quote by American graphic designer Paula Scher was in response to this outcome. This incident spurred an AIGA-led effort to overhaul the graphic design of elections materials, starting with designing a better ballot. This is what led me on the quest to first understand the history of ballot design in Dallas. I wanted to know if design truly could throw elections. Also, AIGA stands for the American Institute of Graphic Arts. So I conducted this research project back in 2020 and reached out to the Dallas County Elections Department and Texas Secretary of State and was told that they would be unavailable until far after the election. Given that the 2020 presidential election was one of the most contentious that we have ever witnessed, I gave them a break. So I pivoted and interviewed other subject matter experts, such as an elections law professor here at SMU, the League of Women Voters Dallas Leadership, and the president of Clean Elections Texas. What I realized was that my understanding of design in the context of voting was incredibly limited. I discovered that voting is a multi-step process of which the actual act of casting the ballot is the final step. The entire voter experience included registering to vote, learning about the issues, and then voting. Each of these steps produced new graphics that I would have to analyze. However, from my interviews and secondary research, I became aware of the service design of each of these steps as well, making the entire voter experience look a little more like this. So in order to comprehensively answer my question of whether design could throw elections, I had to understand both types of design. the visible graphic design of materials produced by Dallas County, and the invisible service design put in place by Dallas County. However, it is important to note that the Dallas County Elections Department is not responsible for the design of the end-to-end voter experience. The political events of this year made me re-examine the role of the state versus the county when it comes to elections design. Steps designed by the state of Texas are red, Dallas County, blue, and by external parties such as NGOs and nonprofits are represented in yellow. You'll also notice that some of the boxes have both colors. That means that both entities are involved in shaping its design. So, register. Dallas County may be in charge of providing voter registration cards for residents, but the voter registration card is designed by the Department of the Texas Secretary of State. Voter eligibility is also determined by the state of Texas. Learn. In the Learn step, third-party organizations such as the League of Women Voters Dallas were the ones educating voters on candidates and measures that would be voted on. Dallas County did provide a website, but this was primarily for finding one's polling location and checking one's registration status. Through my correspondence with the Department of the Texas Secretary of State, I found out that each of the 254 counties in Texas, including Dallas County, was responsible for the design of its own ballot and the creation of election materials for its own elections. So there are three main different types of the vote casting experience in Texas. Some counties in Texas have an analog process from start to finish. Ballots are filled in and counted by hand. Other counties, voters mark paper ballots, which they then insert into a scanner, which also acts as a counting device. And the final option is direct record electronic systems. So this is where the voter makes their choices on a touch screen and presses vote, and then another machine registers their decision. This is the model that Dallas uses. So Dallas uses the Express Vote ballot marking device, which prints out a marked ballot, which the voter then must cast into the DS200 ballot counter. All this is to say that the voter experience design of Texas can vary across all 254 counties, and Dallas is just one of them. So before we dive into an analysis of graphic and service design, let's review the eligibility requirements for voting in Texas. So first, you are a US citizen. You are a resident of the county where you submit the application. You are at least 18 years old. You are not a convicted felon, and you have not been declared by a court exercising probate jurisdiction to be either totally or partially mentally incapacitated without the right to vote. First glance, they might seem reasonable, but you are a United States citizen. So you can be naturalized if you're 18 and have lived in the US for at least 5 years. But what does it mean when being in the US for 1 year without legal status means being deported to your country of origin for 10 years before being able to apply again? DACA recipients are allowed to apply for a driver's license, social security number, and work permit. They pay $60 billion in taxes each year. So what did we mean when we said no taxation without representation? Who did that really apply to? The financial costs and also transportational costs, everything adds up to a way in which poor folks and most likely people of color are unable to readily have forms of photo ID. Yes, time, money, and transportation to procure a photo ID or apply for a reasonable impediment declaration. What is that and how do you get that? Well, by showing your birth certificate, current utility check, bank statement, government check, paycheck, government document with name and address, and voter registration certificate. If you are a homeless individual, if you are a homeless American, if you do not have something that shows that you have a home or a shelter, you lose the right to vote. You are not a convicted felon. So this falls under an unofficial poll tax for Texas, because even if you've completed your sentence, failure to pay the associated fines leaves you still disenfranchised. So BIPOC people and people living in poverty have a higher likelihood of being wrongfully convicted and are unable to afford the help to appeal their convictions and pay necessary fines. Texas has the 9th largest prison population in the world. Black Americans are only 13% of the American population, but a majority of those wrongfully sentenced. They constitute 47% of the 1,900 exonerations listed in the National Registry of Exonerations as of October 2016. Hispanic and Latinx folks comprise only 12% of exonerees, despite making up 22% of the incarcerated population. So what is a felony? How do you become a convicted felon? Let's talk about that. The maximum punishment for the least severe felony, a state jail felony, is 180 days to 2 years in jail and up to a $10,000 fine in Texas. This is the punishment for using a vehicle to evade arrest or credit card abuse. Under the 24th Amendment, poll tax in elections for federal officials is prohibited. Finally, Americans with disabilities and neurodiverse Americans under guardianships or conservatorships can get their right to vote taken away by judges. So eligibility requirements in Texas already create invisible constraints for which groups of people can even enter the first step of the voter experience journey. As we look at how the design of this process affects eligible voters, we must also remember those we are intentionally excluding. With that being said, let's move into methodology. I evaluated the visible design of Dallas County elections materials according to the best practices laid out by the American Institute of Graphic Arts through their publication, Design for Democracy, Ballot and Election Design, which was created for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. I evaluated the service design of Dallas County elections by comparing it to the service design of the Secretary of State of Oregon. Oregon collaborated with AIGA to implement voter experience best practices for both graphic and service design. So to answer the question of whether or not better graphic and service design had an impact on voter turnout or simply why Oregon, I did some extra research. Dallas County hadn't released its voter turnout data officially at the time in which I conducted this. So I took the numbers reported from various news sources and the number of registered voters in Dallas to calculate the voter turnout rate of Dallas County and the voter turnout rate of registered voters in Dallas County. And this was only 41% for 2020. In comparison, the 2020 voter turnout rate of Texas as a whole seems impressive at a rate of 66%. Our highest turnout rate for a presidential general election in decades was still lower than the average turnout rate of a gubernatorial general election in Oregon. So the around 23% difference in average voter turnout rate indicates that Oregon must be doing something right. But in order to make this a fair critique and not a roast of Texas, I also want to point out that the United States voter turnout compared to our economic and democratic peers in the UN OECD is terrible. So in the 2020 presidential election, we had a historic turnout rate. That was still only 66% of the voter eligible population, not too far from Texas's rate. So how that translates internationally is not that impressive. We rank 30th place out of 35 OECD nations. So for the first step of voting, registering to vote, Dallas County's voter registration card met 3 out of 6 AIGA best practices. From the great variation of font size, unnatural boxing of information, and prioritization of types of information, it felt as though the priority of the graphic design of the card was to fit in as much information as possible, organized in a way that was easy to process for the administrator. There's also a large amount of real estate dedicated to emphasizing the legal punishment that can occur from not meeting eligibility requirements. The service design of voter registration in Dallas County is built on the invisible assumptions of a certain financial level of a voter. The voter must be able to transport themselves, purchase an ID, and have a job that enables them to leave during business hours. The cost of ownership of an ID is expensive. Even the cheapest form of ID requiring at least 3 hours of a Texan who makes minimum wage to be able to afford. Oregon, on the other hand, creates an automatic voter registration system that renews a citizen and gives them an option of opting out to vote. Oregon also builds its encouragement for younger voters by allowing them to register at age 16, mailing them a ballot only once they turn 18. So a study conducted by the Tufts by Tufts University showed that being exposed to civic engagement and encouragement to vote early on increased the likelihood of people to vote. The closest we get to that in Dallas is the high school poll worker program. To register to vote in Dallas, Texas, an American must have the means to purchase an ID and a means to transport oneself. To register to vote in Oregon, an American just needs a mailbox. For the second step of voting, learning about the candidates and issues, Dallas County meets 2 out of 5 AIGA best practices. Though its website encourages voter registration and participation, as well as advertises election agency, it doesn't provide this information clearly, nor provide materials on the candidates or issues. One would assume that going to the voter information tab would allow us to access background information on candidates and issues. However, it only provides logistical and not educational information about the upcoming election. Then we would most naturally assume that elected officials might have the information we're looking for in order to learn more about our candidates and election officials. Clicking on candidate information takes us to the Texas Secretary of State's website, which gives us information on how to be a candidate. From there, it took at least 3 distinct clicks for me to get to a candidate lookup tool. But the information on that candidate was minimal, giving us only contact information, occupation, and party of the candidate. The closest source of information to candidates and policies was actually in the Related Links tab. The vague title didn't indicate what type of information to expect and only shows us hyperlinks to political parties. Clicking the Student Voting Guide took us to a national voter education website on how to vote rather than candidates and issues. Dallas County assumes that most or all voters have access to technology or are digitally proficient in this step. The invisible design of voter education in Dallas County is not accommodating to citizens from more diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. For potential low-income voters who often work multiple jobs and must address more pressing daily concerns of survival, it is difficult to access the means and time to research. In Oregon, 2 voter pamphlets are mailed to each residential household 1 month before the election. Voter pamphlets contain an explanation on a voter's rights, a voter registration card, a list of all candidates that are running with their positions on major issues, a list of all legislation to be voted on, including details of arguments for, against, and resulting impact of potential legislation being passed. And these are also available online. Americans in Dallas County receive the full brunt of research responsibility for their candidates and policies. Americans in Oregon are provided with trustworthy, fact-checked information on their candidates and policies and how they will be impacted. For the final step of the voting process, so actual voting, the Express Vote machine fulfills 2 out of 4 AIGA best practices for an in-person voting experience. What you need to know here is that in terms of actual interaction, voters prefer to verbally ask poll workers for guidance rather than look at the actual screen to learn how to use it. This may be due to the fact that the location of the instructions were on the machine and not on the screen. However, I do want to say that Dallas County has taken aggressive efforts to improve the voting experience, even going as far as investing $30 million in 2019 to buy new voting equipment for all voting centers to use. This investment aims to even out the discrepancies that could happen with different ballot marking, casting, and counting devices between all 1,518 precincts in Dallas County by eliminating any equipment discrepancies there may have been while casting a vote. So to gain firsthand understanding of the service design of in-person voting in Dallas County, I worked as a poll worker during Election Day 2020. Throughout my shift, I noticed that many voters were struggling with marking their ballots due to the length of the election. They had to go through 32 screens total. Some elderly voters were actually struggling to grip the stylus in a way and apply enough pressure for the machine to register their choices. So many voters were confused at the summary screen when they were presented with an editable summary of their choices despite the available instructions. So I will call out here that all polling places must meet accessibility standards, whether it be wheelchair accommodating, have handrails, have cut curbs, have accommodations for low to no vision, low to no hearing, and any physical disabilities, and also at least one type of accessible voting equipment. and assistance must be provided for voters who cannot read or write, have physical disabilities, and cannot speak English. Emphasizing here that being unable to read does not disqualify you from your right to vote. Being unable to speak English and read English does not disqualify you from being able to vote in this country. So despite the fact that under Texas state law, all polling places must meet these accessibility standards and provide assistance to voters who require it, the voting experience itself was still difficult or confusing to many voters. I also noticed that many voters tried to use their phones despite not being allowed to. They used them for looking up candidates and vocab that they didn't recognize. So as it stands, the service design of the in-person voting experience in Dallas County is based on heavy assumptions on the able-bodiedness, education level, time availability, and digital fluency of its voters. But once again, I want to underscore the Dallas County Elections Department's efforts to make voting more accessible. In 2018, the DCED tested out a countywide polling place program system for early voting, meaning that early voters in Dallas County could cast their ballots from any precinct, not just their own. Their votes would be counted in a centralized database rather than by an individual precinct basis. And after having tested the system out during early voting, Dallas County decided to roll out the CWPP system for the general elections for 2020. So this eliminated an extra research step for many potential voters who would only have to look up polling stations near them, including their workplaces and not just their residences, rather than also having to make sure that they were in the right voting precinct. This was great because it also makes it harder for malicious actors to turn away voters from polling places because they were at the wrong precinct. According to Dan Cox, research director at Public Religion Research Institute, roughly 1 in 10 Hispanic people said that the last time they or someone in their household tried to vote, they were bothered at the polls. And yet, despite Dallas County's best efforts to make voting more accessible for Dallas residents, the Texas legislature didn't seem to want to cooperate. Under the newly passed Senate Bill 1, we must now adhere to the following new requirements, bans, powers, and my personal favorite, crimes. So first, there are new requirements to submit personal information for those assisting people with voting and additional ID requirements for mail-in ballots. Next, we are no longer allowed to have 24-hour voting centers or drive-through voting, 2 features pioneered by Harris County and Houston that enabled more BIPOC and lower-income folks to vote due to flexibility outside of normal working hours, as well as the safety it provided from COVID-19. Then, SB 1 empowers candidates to sue election opponents or somebody acting on their behalf for illegal acts, such as the illegal delivery of mail-in ballots for up to $1,000 a head. In Texas, political candidates nominate poll watchers from their own party to go and watch polling stations. The specific wording used in the bill is, a watcher may not be denied free movement where election activity is occurring. And it also makes it a crime with a jail term for up to 1 year for election officers to deny access to a poll watcher. Historically, watchers have been used to intimidate voters, particularly BIPOC folks. When I was working as an elections worker on Election Day 2020, we had 2 poll watchers empowered by a Republican Party candidate who would regularly hover very closely behind any BIPOC person during their check-in process to check for fraud. And this was under the previous guidelines where poll watchers were supposed to sit at a location with an unobstructed view and stay there without interacting or interfacing with any of the voters or election workers. And finally, you can get charged with a 3rd-degree felony for in-person interaction with 1 or more voters in the presence of the ballot or during the voting process with the intent to persuade them to vote for a specific candidate or measure. And you can get charged with a state jail felony if you are a public official who sends an application to vote by mail to someone who didn't request it. So these bad boys have a penalty of jail time of up to 10 years and 2 years respectively. Oh, but sorry, I'm being unfair. We mustn't forget the voting rights expansion granted to us by this bill. Polling places must now be open 9 hours, an increase from the mandatory 8 hours, and still a definite decrease from the 24-hour option. With that, let's jump into the graphic design of the mail-in ballot. For the sake of time, I'll only be briefly covering the graphic design of mail-in ballots. This decision is also because most Dallas voters are ineligible to vote by mail in the first place. Voters must be 65 or older, have a disability, be out of county, or have applied for a mail-in ballot at least 10 days before Election Day. Fear of COVID-19 was actually ruled as not a valid enough excuse to qualify for a mail-in ballot. The instructions page meets 0 out of 5 best practices, and the graphic design priority of the instructions page of the mail-in ballot was to fit in as much legally required information as possible and did not prioritize voter comprehension of the material, how to fill in a ballot, and how to mail this properly. I'll also add that a coalition of advocates for Texans with disabilities sued the state of Texas in federal court in the summer of 2020. For disabled voters who do not have assistance at home and cannot fill out a mail-in ballot either due to sight or mobility issues, they were also put at risk of potentially exposing themselves to COVID-19 by asking someone to help them. In this case, what they were asking for wasn't unreasonable. They were asking for the same accommodations already extended to active military members and Texans living overseas. These voters are sent electronic ballots, which can be filled out through computers. Now, let's flip the page. The back page meets 2 out of 5 AIGA best practices. Despite its graphic design sins, I'd actually like to highlight its content. Proposition E is where most voters took out their phones while trying to vote. I'll read this out loud. The issuance of $33,500,000 of bonds for the construction, acquisition, and equipment to provide improvements and renovations of existing district natatoriums, and levying of a tax sufficient to pay the principal of and interest on the bonds and the costs of any credit agreements executed in connection with the bonds. And in all caps, this is a property tax increase. I put the text of this proposition into a Flesch-Kincaid readability analysis tool. The reading level of this text was 17th grade and would be easily understood by 22 to 23-year-olds. To be clear, this would translate to a graduate school level reading level. Using the word natatorium instead of indoor swimming pool is an unnecessary and intentional language decision that makes comprehension more difficult for people from diverse educational backgrounds. So what is the use of the law saying that we cannot discriminate against voters who can't read when we write so they can't understand? Give me a sec, I've been talking a lot. In terms of service design, the potential voter must not only meet the eligibility requirements for voting, but also for mail-in voting. They must then have the financial means to print and mail an application for the mail-in ballot before even interacting with the mail-in ballot. After the voter did receive a mail-in ballot kit, they would be presented with an overwhelming amount of different papers with no visual guide on how to use it, as seen below. This is courtesy of the League of Women Voters Dallas. The League of Women Voters Dallas independently released a how-to guide and video online to assure voters that they would be allowed to fold the ballot in order to fit into the smaller envelope it was supposed to be sent back in. Intuitively, the size of the ballot compared to the size of the envelope it was supposed to be mailed in did not make sense to many voters. In Dallas County, voters must actively apply for, including paying for postage, and ensure the safe delivery of an unclearly designed mail-in ballot. Oregon eliminates the financial and time barrier of the mail-in ballots by actively sending out mail-in ballots to each registered voter with no cost to mail the ballot back for the voter. In summary, Dallas County has a long way to go. From a graphic design perspective, the priorities of the elections materials lay in saving budget through cramming in text and making the information processing easier for administrators. From a service design perspective, Dallas County was missing an entire step in the voter experience journey, the step of voter education. For the final step of voting, the service design of voting in Dallas County was developed with a person with access to transportation, financial means to an ID, and financial flexibility for working around business hours in mind. Mail-in ballots are great equalizers to access to voting in that voters do not have to make that extra time in their day to plan for the logistics of traveling to a polling station. The barriers created by the service design of Dallas County and the steps of registering, learning, and voting help support the national trend of lower income minorities being less likely to vote. From various surveys and studies, we know these invisible assumptions designed an experience that was more accessible to higher income Americans and less accessible to lower income Americans. This becomes an issue of representation because the issues that lower income Americans care about are different from those that higher income Americans care about. And how they vote, if given the opportunity, could dramatically change political outcomes. So, what does any of this have to do with the built environment? Well, I'll pass it off to Colin to answer that. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Christina. So what Christina raised about the voter experience in Dallas from a graphic and service design perspective also interfaces with the design of the built environment. Specifically, we're going to shift the lens of this conversation into an exploration of the intersection of the built environment and civic engagement. What does this look like in Dallas? Why this even matters? Who is impacted at this intersection? And how we can train ourselves to see better and incorporate this lens of understanding in our daily design practices. But before we get going into that, let's pause and scream through another round of everyone's favorite segment, what the actual F is happening in Texas. So Texas has been in the news a lot this year because we love being the center of attention for many things outside of just voting. From an infrastructure perspective, Texas's fierce desire to be independent left a crumbling electric grid unable to withstand a winter storm, even though regulators and lawmakers knew of the vulnerabilities. Texas's Department of Transportation has received criticism from the feds because Texas would not stop working on their planned highway expansion in Houston, which would displace over 1,000 residents in a historically Black neighborhood. The feds told them to stop twice. On a civil rights front, Texas lawmakers also banned abortions after 6 weeks and deputized any US citizen to enforce this law with a minimum $10,000 reward for anyone identifying and reporting people breaking the law. Texas has also passed 2 laws essentially banning the discussion of race or slavery in Texas schools, in the second most diverse state in the US, while also limiting discussion of current events and prohibiting academic credit for civic engagement. And just this week, Texas lawmakers have drawn criticism for their redistricting efforts as they are appearing to not reflect the changes in Texas's demographics over the past 10 years. So what do all these have in common? They impact the physical and civic infrastructure, which either supports or hinders the ways we are able to carry out civic engagement while reinforcing systems of power and white supremacy. So my research focuses on the impacts of the built environment in either perpetuating or not perpetuating justice and equity in our cities, particularly along racial and economic lines, which in the US are highly correlated. And this is incredibly true in the context of Dallas County. My journey in infrastructure started with unpacking the ways Black and Mexican American neighborhoods in Dallas were dismantled and erased by Dallas's highways, parks, and other infrastructure, and the ways white engineering and planning professionals who look like me leveraged power and privilege to control not only the built environment, but political processes as well. So in terms of our discussion today, we'd like to focus on the elements where the built environment and civic engagement intersect, because voting and civic engagement matter immensely. Those processes directly shape the environment around us. The built environment, as distinguished from, say, the natural environment, is defined as anything human-made surrounding you right now, above or below ground, the stuff we live in and move around in, which supports human activity. It differs from the natural environment because it has intent, funding, and planning that humans inject to shape the world around us. So let's visualize maybe how we got to work today or got to where we are right now. Did you use a street? Did you use public transit? Are you in a building? Or maybe you're in a park? All of these are elements of what we are considering the built environment. On the other hand, civic engagement is the way we individually and collectively work to make a difference in the civic life of our communities through political and non-political responsibilities like voting, neighborhood associations, PTAs, volunteering, really any way that public concerns are raised and community is built. So if we try and visualize civic engagement, imagine the last time you donated to or volunteered at a local organization. Have you participated in a block cleanup effort, or maybe volunteered at a community garden? What drew you to engage in those activities? Actions of civic engagement are tools for leveraging community design to shape a more just built environment. So Congress has been debating definitions of infrastructure this year and what qualifies for infrastructure funding. Traditionally, infrastructure is considered the physical things we can see, the most visible aspects of the built environment. While highly visible in many ways, these are nearly invisible elements in our lives that we depend on or make our lives and neighborhoods more livable. In many ways, we're like fish in water. We use physical infrastructure constantly and sometimes lose sight of it because it's generally reliable here in the US. But beyond highways, physical infrastructure can include water and sewer lines, public transit, parks, streets, power lines, and others. And they're all elements of the physical infrastructure which cultivates opportunities in our lives every day. Similar to physical infrastructure, civic infrastructure has components we may not consider immediately. Civic infrastructure includes the elements which support our civic engagement, the open forums and public meetings at City Hall, policies, processes, representation, feelings of safety, cohesion, and inclusion. And voting are the grease which keeps the wheels of democracy turning and are the scaffolding which supports it. So now that we have some definitions in place, let's talk about the intersection of these elements and how they may influence the voter experience. So where the built environment and physical infrastructure intersects with civic engagement and civic infrastructure is where we see community design manifesting. So let's spend some time at that intersection, pun intended. So when we think about voting from a physical infrastructure perspective, one of the first questions we might ask is, where do I vote? So in this map, we see Dallas County outlined by this black square, and all of the black dots represent an election day voting location from our most recent election this past May. So you see around 200 locations spread out across 800 voting precincts countywide. And voting locations in Dallas County are primarily public schools, libraries, recreation centers, and places of worship. This public infrastructure is crucial to the civic engagement process, but is not always a given in every neighborhood, nor are voting centers guaranteed in every precinct. So now that we've identified where we can vote, again, assuming we're not using mail-in ballots, if that's not an option, we have to figure out how to get there. So as we see here, each circle represents a half-mile radius around a public transit stop. So Dallas Area Rapid Transit, also called DART, bus stops are highlighted in blue and light rail stops are highlighted in yellow. And we can see a fairly large difference between various cities in the county. Generally, everything heavily covered by public transit is in the city of Dallas, with some of Dallas's suburbs like Carrollton, Plano, Richardson, and Irving fairly well represented to the north and the east, or the north and the west. And what you see is a large lack of dedicated public transit routes in the southwest, the south, and the east. Cities as a whole, more diverse racially and economically than their northern counterparts. So anywhere there is a black dot not covered by a blue or yellow circle represents a voting center more than half a mile away from a dedicated public transit route, which can have massive accessibility implications for people who either cannot afford car ownership or may need more mobility options beyond a car to effectively engage in the voting process. Even non-vehicle mobility can be a struggle in Dallas. All of these red lines you see are missing sidewalks. The city of Dallas is missing 2,100 miles of sidewalks, further exacerbating mobility and accessibility impacts due to physical infrastructure. And if we zoom in on Oak Cliff, a suburb of Dallas, we can see what areas are missing public transit and sidewalks where voting centers are located. So any location you see colored lines intersecting with a black dot outside of one of these blue or yellow circles could be an accessibility concern. Also missing in some areas that do not have sidewalks are the curb cuts, which make sidewalks accessible. So voting access is about more than just transit stops. It's also about everything in the built environment between the stop and the voting center. They're the stage for which the act of voting plays out, and act as another unofficial poll tax. What we don't necessarily see is the invisible design elements which influence these visible outcomes. So the visible elements of our community design today are fundamentally shaped by historical context, shaped by what is sometimes referred to as the racial geography of our cities, the foundations which the built environment stands on. This is the invisible stage politics plays out on. These homeowners loan corporation maps have resurfaced in the wake of popular books about housing segregation, like The Color of Law, which have brought a renewed interest in understanding the underpinnings of our cities, especially within the context of racial and economic exclusion. For a quick recap on the meanings of the colors, red and yellow were considered hazardous for federally backed mortgages. And in Dallas, these ratings typically applied to Black, Mexican, or Latin American, or non-English speaking European immigrants. Blue and green were considered the most desirable from a mortgage lending perspective and were restricted to white neighborhoods. If we look at how this map has translated to present day Dallas, we can see many of the outcomes from those 80-year-old policies reverberate into the racial and economic segregation in Dallas today. This last map shows the present distribution of low income and people of color in the city of Dallas today. Areas with no shading are predominantly white and higher income. Yellow areas are above average low income. Blue areas are above average populations of people of color, and green are above average both low income and populations of color. Our mechanisms of the built environment have shaped Dallas's residents of color for generations, with long-lasting effects from visible design like loan maps, segregated neighborhoods, and food and infrastructure apartheid. And all of these and more are further shaped by invisible design of loan rates and access, land use burdens like concentrated air pollution, industrial zoning, and even political representation and districting. So homeowners loan corporation maps are not the only invisible design element shaping our communities. Eminent domain, slum clearance, urban renewal, and even local land use and zoning influenced and continue to influence what is built, where it is built, and why it is built. Policies which control land use function as surrogates for maintaining and shaping systems of civic and political power. Eminent domain is the use of federal power to take over land for public use. It's a constitutional right, and in Dallas's context, was used to not only create highways through the middle of neighborhoods of color, but also to move people around so they weren't present in areas making white people uncomfortable, like through building parking lots for the State Fair of Texas. In some instances, eminent domain functioned as a sorting mechanism, which dispersed Dallas's Black and Mexican American neighbors from their homes and neighborhoods. Slum clearance and urban renewal were federal programs to remove and improve what was called quote unquote slum and quote unquote blighted areas, most often used for the development of highways and public housing projects, which in Dallas's context took many landowners and made them renters. In a country where owning land is a powerful factor in the political process, this has massive ramifications for who controls shaping the built environment. Zoning is a more local approach to defining how land can be used. Not all cities have zoning ordinances. Houston doesn't, for example, but Dallas, like many other cities in the US, have developed zoning patterns where unwanted land uses are situated near low income or neighborhoods of color, burdening residents with lost property value and rights to a healthy life, like having a 200,000 ton mountain of shingles in the middle of a Black and Mexican American neighborhood in South Dallas. BIPOC neighborhoods across Dallas are now fighting these invisible design elements through neighborhood associations, standing up at city council meetings, city planning commission meetings, and influencing the future of their neighborhoods and our city with grassroots-led community design. So where people live and vote matters. This past weekend, the Texas legislature revealed their redistricting map for state Senate districts based upon the updated 2021 census data. Nearly all of the gains in Texas's population in the census came from people of color, primarily those identifying as Hispanic in the census. The new map was developed in such a way that no new districts of color have been added to the districting, diluting the representational power for Texas's residents of color. Voting rights watch groups in Texas and across the country are speaking out against the maps, which are proposed to gerrymander political lines so that any competitive district becomes a comfortable majority for incumbent Republicans, as you can see by the very strangely shaped districts in the photo on the right. All of this, once again, shows the cycle of how our ability to be civically engaged and shape the built environment in turn affects our ability to be civically engaged. All of these human and voting rights violations are 100% legal because the people making the laws and voting for these laws are not the ones most affected by them.
Through this session, we encouraged you to think of the voting experience beyond the final act of casting a ballot and highlighted the importance of considering eligibility, which rules out voters before they can even begin, the hidden costs and inaccessibility of voter registration, and the lack of government-facilitated voter education on candidates and policies. We came to learn that even if the visible graphic design and the invisible service design were to meet AIGA requirements and standards, its efficacy would be severely limited by the visible and invisible community design that shapes the environment of our voters. As a county and a state, we have great challenges to voter accessibility ahead of us. However, we haven't lost the faith. We look for the helpers and do what we can with what we have. This past summer, I was able to share my research and insights with the newly minted elections administrator of the Dallas County Elections Department. He was receptive and appreciative of my work and said that he'd use it as a part of his research as he began to build his strategy for Dallas County. Michael Scarpello and his team bring elections experience from Denver, Nebraska, California, places with more accessible voting processes. We look forward to his vision and leadership because we're going to have to get creative under these new constraints. The invisible assumptions create barriers that are disproportionately difficult for poor and minority Americans in Dallas County to exercise their right to vote. Graphic design may have thrown an election in Palm Beach County, Florida in 2000, but community design regularly throws elections by preventing people from all socioeconomic walks of life from casting their votes easily. The future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. From the low to no cost voter experience designed by Oregon, we know that we can create a more equitable voting access to all. It already exists in America, it just hasn't been equally distributed yet. Design is critical to ensuring who gets to have a say and who gets to be involved. As a Dallas community, we should aim to design a voter experience that is inclusive in graphic, service, and community design for every step of the voter experience. As a community of designers, we should aim to look at the creation of the greater built environment and how they determine outcomes before we can even get our hands on them. Better election design helps a select few. Better community design helps all. It's time for us to recognize the power and responsibility of design to create a more equitable civic future for us all. So thank you so much for listening to our lecture/sermon parts 1 and 2. I know that was a lot to throw at y'all. So we did have some questions prepared, but I think we probably just want to hold off and let the group speak. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen for now.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you, Colin. That was a really, really well done presentation. There were 2 questions in the chat. One of them I think you spoke to in terms of like presenting the work to the county. It's great that you have that relationship. A question, another question in the chat is, could you talk a bit about the process for creating new polling places, or determining where they are located? Yeah, if we can address that question, that'd be great.
So I'm not sure what the process is like anymore, but when I also, Colin, I see that you've unmuted, but my initial reading of it was, I think places could actually apply to be polling places. And so that's where things become a bit of a problem, because places that already have the economic means, the accessible buildings, and also have an incentive to make voting easier for people will be offering it. So in the past few local elections, I have been voting in really nice, beautifully built churches because I live in an environment next to SMU, which is in Highland, which is what, University Park. And so it's one of the most affluent areas in Dallas County. Colin, I'm gonna let you also color that in.
Oh, you're spot on. I was just going to say it is an application process for those sites that are outside of, say, schools or some of the other areas. I know my own place of worship has filed for that application, but you're right. It does. You have to meet all those requirements and all of that, and you have to be somewhere that has the space and all those other kinds of things that can facilitate the voting process. So it's a little tricky sometimes.
Thank you. And I see that I'm also a big fan of BC Workshop, and I see that, Colin, you are as well. Yeah. I think, they're obviously doing great work in your state. I was wondering if there's any other groups that you wanted to give a shout out to, or any other partners that are doing the work on the ground that maybe some of our participants in the audience might want to follow or support.
I think from the built environment perspective, it doesn't get any better than BC Workshop in Texas. Their community-led design and the way that they approach working with communities and allowing communities and neighborhoods to be the center of their visioning and creation process is pretty incredible. I might raise up the Neighborhood Self-Defense Project here in Dallas. It's another grassroots organization. It's a little more of an environmental justice effort focused on, again, leading neighborhoods to redesigning their built environments and their communities to serve their interests and to get rid of a lot of the unwanted land uses that are making them sick and keeping them from actively engaging in their civic processes.
Thanks so much. Well, this is my first ACD conference as a new board member, and I have to tell you, it's been a really, really great one. Colin, if you have a link for that group, if you could share in the chat, someone is asking for that. But again, I just wanted to thank Christina and thank Colin and thank all of you for attending today. Also, just want to give you a little bit of information about what's upcoming today. We have two panels coming up. One is Acknowledge and Listen, Undoing Colonial Design in Massachusetts. That's going to be starting at 1:15. And then I'll be on a panel actually after that as well. Equity by Design, Creating Housing and Multi-Generational Communities with AARP. I'll be speaking about my work with the High Line, and also will be joined by Fernando Gomez from Penn South Program for Seniors and Esther Greenhouse, who works with AARP. So just wanted to give you a reminder about those panels. Thanks everyone again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Also just wanted to say that we do have like a last slide. We're going to be sharing this out, but they consist of key takeaways. So what can we start doing? And then it also has links to various different organizations that really help to bolster voter rights. So we'll send all of that over to y'all after, but thank you so much again for listening.
Thanks everybody. Bye.